Welcome to Our College, Your Voices. I'm your host, Kara Monroe.
Today, we're going to be talking about the college's government relations efforts, both at the federal level and the state level. We will hear about what our college does in terms of government relations, how it works, and what issues we're following in this legislative session. We will also hear about the differences in advocating for the college at the federal level and the state level. And finally, we're going to hear why it's important that the college have individuals specifically dedicated to government relations. And I am very pleased to have our primary government relations expert with us today, and that's Jane Michalak. Hi, MJ.
Good morning, Kara. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Would you tell everybody a little bit about your Ivy Tech story, title, how long you've been here, all that sort of stuff?
Sure. I have been with Ivy Tech for about 4 years. Prior to coming to Ivy Tech, I spent about a little over 10 years in and around state government. I was a reporter for a niche publication that covered education policy. And then I worked for the Indiana Department of Education for a couple of years. I worked for the Department of Local Government Finance, which oversees the state property tax system. And then I led the former agency called the State Student Assistance Commission of Indiana, which was the financial aid administration agency, helped merge that into the Commission for Higher Education, and then was with the Commission for Higher Ed for about 3 years.
All right, so let's dive into the questions. I think this is a little bit like the finance episode we did just a few weeks ago. It's sort of a government relations 101 for folks who've not really engaged with this activity at the college. So let's start with, what does someone who works in government relations for a college or university do? And why is it important to have someone in a role dedicated to this, especially at Ivy Tech?
Someone who works in government relations for a college or university actually has a different role depending on the time of year and the time of day, quite frankly. So one of the primary functions that I serve is being a liaison to the Indiana General Assembly, which is a part-time legislature. So they are only in session 4 months out of the year at most. But when they are in session, my primary role is to follow the bills that are being filed, weigh in on legislation that affects the college, attend committee hearings so that I can hear the discussions that are taking place, and really just advise the legislature on the effects of legislation and policy that they're making and how that affects both the college in an operational standpoint, as well as how it affects our curriculum and students. When the legislature is not in session, my primary function is to have continued meetings with legislators throughout the year, making sure that they're aware of what is happening at Ivy Tech. And then I also have close relationships with individuals who are in state agencies. So specifically the Commission for Higher Education, Department of Workforce Development, the governor's office, to some extent, the Economic Development Corporation, although not as much as the Commission for Higher Education of the government and the governor's office, the Department of Education as well, but again, to a lesser extent than the Commission for Higher Education. During the non-session months, I am attending Commission for Higher Ed meetings. I am meeting with officials in state government to talk to them about the way that policy has been set and how the administration of that policy is working, to talk about initiatives that play into their specific functions. So, for example, the governor's office likes to keep tabs on what's happening with the Workforce Ready grant, because that was an initiative that the governor pushed and continues to champion. So we give regular updates on that. There are also times when we are talking to state leaders, specifically now during the pandemic, on how the college can help and what role the college can play in economic recovery, as well as serving the community through serving as a vaccination station or COVID testing centers. So there is some of that in my responsibility as well. The other part of my job is focused on federal legislation and federal relations, and we do have some assistance from outside entities that help me with that, because federal government relations is a little bit different than state government relations. And I can talk a little bit about that in a minute. So it's communicating with our congressional leaders. So federal Congress is a full-time legislative body. So The congressional leaders are in session year round. So it works a little bit different than the state. But we need to make sure that we are telling our congressional leaders what's happening back home because they're not in Indiana all the time and they don't always see what's happening. So one of the reasons why it's so important for us to have good relationships is because this can help us circumvent bad public relations. It can help kill legislation that would be administratively burdensome on us. One example is a time when the Commission for Higher Education was about to release their college completion report. And we were able to find an error in the data, and it was a combination of the way Ivy Tech was reporting the information and the way the Commission for Higher Education was pulling the information that contributed to the error. But really what the story would have been had it gone out the way it was that the completion rates at Ivy Tech were plummeting. And that was not a good story to tell, nor was it true. And so because I had such good relationships with the Commission for Higher Education, when we realized that there was a mistake, we were able to convince them to hold off in issuing the report until we were able to find out what the issue was. And that was literally the day and within hours of their planned release. The Commissioner for Higher Education had media plans. She was going on some radio shows to talk about the report. And so it really caused a little bit of chaos. But because we had good relationships, they trusted that I knew what I was talking about when I said there was an error, and they trusted that it would be bad for them to move forward with that type of report. And again, it was a combination between how we reported and the way the commission pulled the data. So there really wasn't a finger pointing of whose fault is it. It was really a collaborative relationship. And let's get to the bottom of where the issue is so that it can be right for everyone.
Excellent.
So that's a little bit about the role.
As you were in session right now in the state General Assembly, what does a day in the life look like for you during session?
During session, as I indicated, I am primarily focused on what is happening at the State House. What is the legislature doing? What are they contemplating? So I review all of the bills that are filed to determine whether or not there is an effect on Ivy Tech as a college. So I look for whether it has an effect on us as an employer, whether it has an effect on the curriculum, the academic area, whether it has effect on our students or how we will be administering programs for the college. So for example, right now, some of the legislation that we're tracking has to do with COVID immunity for cities, towns, and higher education entities. So that's from a employer standpoint, as well as from a college standpoint, and making sure that we have a safe place for our students and workers, but also understanding that if someone does get sick while they are at Ivy Tech, it's not necessarily the fault of the college that happens. We're tracking a bill that would, I don't want to say dictate, but would have an effect on how colleges can admit students. So while we're open enrollment, it doesn't have as big of an impact on us as it does some of the other schools like Indiana University Bloomington or Purdue West Lafayette. But because there is a higher ed component in there, we track it more closely in case an amendment is made that would affect us. There is a bill regarding a course access program, which we call ICAP, that has an effect on online course offerings to students in the K-12 system. We are looking at a bill that requires students in high school to file the FAFSA. We're looking at bills that address changes in tuition and charges for veterans. The first day of K-12 schools is a bill we track because there's an effect on, how many days of school there are and how we would address the dual credit curriculum and what effect that might have on us. From an employer standpoint, there's a bill on whistleblower reports that would address the way that public employees can report wrongdoing. So those are just a couple of examples of bills that have an effect on us. But so really just tracking that legislation, attending hearings if I need to speak to the effect on Ivy Tech, and really doing a lot of behind the scenes work and talking to legislators. The biggest issue that we have right now is the state budget, which is a biennial budget. So every 2 years, the legislature comes and talks about how they will allocate the funds that the state receives. Ivy Tech receives more than 50% of our operation funds from the state funds. So it is very important to us that we make sure the legislature knows the effect of the budgeting process on us and how we are operating, what the funds that the taxpayers provide to us really support.
Excellent. And I really appreciate being on the sort of receiving end of some of your bill review. I appreciate not only that you go through all of those for us, but then you circulate them to those of us who are going to be, our teams or our areas are going to be impacted, and you get our feedback. You do such a great job with that. So I appreciate that. And I think I owe you feedback on a couple. So I will get that done for you. You alluded to this in your response to the first question, but particularly now we're recording this January 22nd. So we just saw the inauguration of a new administration and obviously the change in the legislature to being now democratically controlled. What are the differences between our state General Assembly operation and how Congress operates? And how does that affect your role in government relations?
Thanks, Kara. Yes, I appreciate the fact that you all give me feedback on those bills. I'm certainly not an expert on the operations of the college, so I might know how to navigate the halls of the State House, but you all are the experts and really on the impacts of those bills. The primary difference, as I indicated, is we have a part-time General Assembly, which means that typically the legislators are in the Indianapolis State House 4 days a week. They don't work at the State House on Fridays. They have full-time jobs that they go back to in the different parts of their state. And then again, they only work at the State House in session at most 4 months, 5 months out of the year. They start in January and they typically end by April 29th or April 30th. So really there is a sprint to get work done during those 4 months. And so it's a very fast pace, whereas Congress is a full-time Congress and they meet year round. They do have some breaks where the congressional leaders come back to their states and meet with constituents, but there is not as much of a frantic pace to get work done in a short period of time because they have a longer window with which to pass bills. Another difference is how the committees work at the state level versus the federal level. At the state level, anyone can testify on the topics of the bills. So anyone from the college in their own individual capacity could show up and they could testify on any bill that's being heard that particular day. Now, the caveat being during COVID, there are some different processes taking place, but generally speaking, anyone, any member of the public can come in and testify on any topic that's being debated. At the federal level, individuals have to be invited to testify, and there is a long process that happens in submitting the testimony that's going to be given and providing that several days in advance. It's a very formal process at the federal level, and the congressional record is open. So the submitted written testimony is added, as well as the questions and answers that take place during the live testimony. That's then entered into the congressional record for several days after. Whereas at the state level, it's a one-time thing. You can testify at the committee during the time of the committee. The legislators can ask questions during the committee, but once the committee is over, it's over. You can still meet with individual legislators, but the opportunity to just come in and testify on a topic at that point is over. The other difference at the federal level is that you really have to plan ahead to meet with your federal officials. You have to make an appointment to meet with them. Sometimes you will meet with them in their office during office hours. Sometimes you will go to a committee hearing room and they'll step out of the committee if a committee ends up taking place at that time. But you really have to have an appointment. Whereas at the state level, I can stand in the hallway, and if I see a legislator walking by, I can approach that legislator and I can have a conversation quickly with them. So it's a lot more informal process at the state level than it is at the federal level.
I will say I had the opportunity to participate in the NASPA Hill Days program a couple of years ago, and it was really interesting to see that difference firsthand in the working at the Capitol in DC versus being at the State House. Because at the State House, you can just easily walk up, not right now as easily, but pre-COVID you could. And that is very interesting to see. You know, one of the big parts of what I see your job as, and where I see so much value in the work that you do, is in sharing our story with the legislature and making sure they know what Ivy Tech is doing and how we do that. What opportunities do you have to share our stories and with the legislators, with other state officials, and how do you go about doing that?
One of the ways that we share our story with legislators is through campus visits and campus engagement. And that's really where I tell the chancellors they own the relationships with our legislators because those state legislators are part of their community. Again, as part-time legislators, they live and work in the same communities where Ivy Tech sits. So whether it's in Lake County or in Sellersburg or in Fort Wayne, the chancellors of those campuses really have the opportunity to know those legislators better than I do because they see them at the grocery store or they see them at church or they have the opportunity to invite them to come to campus on a more regular basis. For me, I see them a lot when they're at the State House, but I also concentrate my efforts at the State House primarily on legislators who sit on the committees that touch legislation that affects us. So that's going to be the education committees and the appropriations committees. So there are really 4 committees that really affect the work that Ivy Tech does. And I concentrate my time on those specific legislators. So campus visits and campus engagement, we invite legislators to come to campus and do campus tours. The State Budget Committee, which is made up of members of both the House and the Senate at the state level, as well as individuals from the State Budget Agency, which is the state agency that oversees the budget and reports up through the governor. We do host meetings from the State Budget Committee from time to time. And so when we have that opportunity, we do campus visits and the chancellors come and talk to those leaders that might not necessarily be from their specific geographical location. I have meetings on a year-round basis. I set meetings up for Dr. Elsterman and others on the leadership team, especially when there's a topic that I am not an expert on. So for example, there are a lot of questions about the career connections work that we do. And so I arrange meetings for Chris Lowry and members of Chris's team on the workforce alignment team to meet with legislators to tell them about what we're doing on career connections. Molly Dodge, Chancellor of Madison, does a lot of work with the Department of Corrections. And so really she takes the lead on that relationship and then keeps me in the loop on what's happening. But so she is able to tell our story to people within the Department of Corrections on what ways we can help those communities that have correctional facilities. Letters from staff or students help tell our stories. A lot of times legislators like to hear from their constituents on really the real world effect of what's happening. So I might be able to tell them a story about a student and what the student is doing, but it means more when it comes directly from that student or directly from a staff member who works with Ivy Tech. As I've mentioned before, I provide testimony on bills. We give budget presentations every 2 years. This year is a little bit different because of COVID and the number of bills that are going through the legislature. And we don't have the opportunity at the House side to give our budget presentation. But typically, we give a presentation for our budget request 4 times. Dr. Elsterman speaks to the Commission for Higher Education. She speaks to the Budget Agency or the Budget Committee. Then she speaks to the House Appropriations Committee, which is called Ways and Means. And then she speaks to the Senate Appropriations Committee. We also give presentations to the Commission for Higher Education on a regular basis. So in years where travel is normal, the Commission for Higher Education travels around the state and holds their meetings in various areas of the state so that the commission members have the opportunity to experience different campuses. Ivy Tech is fortunate that being that we have the campus in Indianapolis, we always host a commission meeting at least once a year. Last year, we were able to host the commission at our Kokomo campus. We had plans to host at another campus within Ivy Tech later this year, but that's up in the air because of COVID. So anyway, giving presentations to the Commission for Higher Education when Ivy Tech hosts. They give us the opportunity to speak to things that a certain campus might be doing and a unique initiative. Sometimes we present to subcommittees of the Commission for Higher Education. So there's a subcommittee for student success, and we have often done presentations, not myself, but people like Corey Klessman Ryan, or I know, Carrie, you've given several presentations on things that we're doing. We've had discussions on our dual credit program through Rebecca Ray Schulte and Cassandra Shipp, and we've talked to the commission about the work that we're doing in co-requisite model with Glenn Eldridge. So those are the types of opportunities that we have. And then finally, the other way that we communicate our story is through positions on the various workforce boards that are around. So for example, Dr. Ellspermann has a position on the governor's workforce cabinet. I know Chris Lowry sits on many boards or serves as our representative from Ivy Tech. We also have individuals from around the state that serve on various boards and commissions, and whether they're local boards and commissions or they're state level boards and commissions, having a representative from Ivy Tech sit on that board, even if it's not in their capacity as an Ivy Tech employee, really helps us show what Ivy Tech is doing out in our communities.
So you already talked about some of the issues you're following at the state level. What are you looking at the federal level right now?
So as you indicated, we did just have an inauguration of a new president. And so with that, the transition of the administration of every agency at the federal level is happening. And so we are watching very closely what is happening at the federal level so that we are able to understand what might be coming down the pike. Perfect example are changes at the Department of Education. So the Secretary of Education has changed. We currently have an interim Secretary of Education until the Congress is able to confirm a new Secretary of Education. Yesterday, the Department of Education announced a bunch of new appointments for a chief of staff, for a chief of staff of the department as a whole, as well as a chief of staff for the Office of Post-Secondary Education. There will be a new undersecretary for the Office of Post-Secondary Education. And so those changes mean that there will be changes in policies that are set. So one example is that President Biden has already extended through at least September 30th, the existing pause on student loan payments and interest on federal student loans. While that doesn't necessarily affect the college as a whole, it does have an effect on our alumni. And so that's something that we want to understand. And so that as our financial aid advisors are talking with students, they can make sure that students are aware of that, because that would affect students who are ready to graduate or who did graduate in December. The president recently reversed an executive order that excluded undocumented immigrants from the census reapportionment count. That will affect us as a college because that affects the numbers of the census, and that affects how the congressional districts are drawn. He issued executive order regarding DACA students, so we've watched that issue closely. They've reinstated some protections to prevent discrimination, so that will have effect under Title IX. So we'll be watching that. There were changes in Title IX under the Trump administration that we anticipate will be rolled back in the coming months. So we'll be watching that. I would also be remiss if I didn't note that there was also another spending bill that has been introduced by President Biden, and that would have an effect on the college because he is asking for $35 billion to go to higher education across the country. So those are some of the things that we're watching in terms of the White House transition, the change in the control of the Senate. While it is a narrow margin that the Democrats now control the Senate, there will be changes in the chairmanships at the federal level and the number of individuals who serve on those congressional committees. So we'll be watching to see if any of our federal congressional leaders have been appointed to new committees. We do have a new representative from the Lake County area. Frank Mervan is our new congressman from the Lake County area, and he has been named to sit on the House Education Committee at the federal level. So I anticipate that we'll be having conversations with him in the coming months so that he's aware of the types of policies that Ivy Tech supports at the federal level.
And this is just an observation, having worked in a role like this one for several years now. This is between COVID and then the change in administration. This is sort of the busiest I think we've been around federal legislation in a while. You're shaking your head. Yes, that accurate?
I would agree with that. Yes. One of the issues that we have been watching for as long as I've been at the college, and even before that, is the issue of reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. The last Congress, so the outgoing Congress, did pass some provisions specifically as it relates to the FAFSA and simplifying the FAFSA. And that had been an initiative that had been championed by Senator Lamar Alexander from Tennessee, who recently retired from the Senate. That was a main issue that we were waiting for, that we thought would be included in the reauthorization of higher ed. But we look at what's happening with the Pell Award amount and whether that's being increased. That was increased with the most recent action of the CRSA law, which was the coronavirus relief law that was passed at the end of December. But yeah, the transition means that there are a lot of things that will be taking place federally, a lot of changes happening. When I started at the college, we were just starting with the administration for President Trump. And so there was a lot of activity then as well, but I don't recall there being as much activity in higher education at that point in time. We weren't anticipating as many executive orders and policy transitions related to higher education as we're anticipating at this point.
Right. And particularly with COVID, everything is just ramped up a little bit too.
Absolutely. Yeah. 4 years ago, obviously COVID was not a thing. And there is a lot of concern about the way that schools have opened or have not opened. And so President Biden did release a 200-page report yesterday that has all kinds of recommendations, including how we operate as an employer and what affects our policies about employer protection work, as well as how we're bringing students back to campus.
I was listening to a couple of podcasts about that this morning. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I know that there's a tremendous amount of guidance in there that feds want us to look at. So MJ, you have done a great job in this episode of talking about the fact that while you have primary responsibility for this role, particularly as we think about Indiana being a citizen legislature that's part-time, they live in our community, we all have a role to play in government relations. So what does our Ivy Tech team need to do to be or to get involved in government relations?
So the first thing, as we're starting on this topic, the first thing that I want to point out is that we do have a political activity policy at the college. And it's very important to note that as an individual, you have freedom of speech and you have rights under the U.S. Constitution, and the college does not infringe upon those rights. But we do have a political activity policy that says that employees of the college can advocate on any issue on their own behalf, but they cannot use their college position to do so or to give the impression that they are speaking on behalf of the college without permission. So it's very important that individuals who want to participate in political activity touch base with your human resources representative, reach out to me to make sure that what you're doing is in line with what our political activity policy is. We try to avoid hosting political events on campus. If we can, we do sometimes, but we make sure that it's open to both parties equally. Actually, all parties, not just the two major parties. But for example, an individual who wants to testify on a bill, let's say that individual is a faculty member. That faculty member can go to the State House and they can speak on behalf of their own personal beliefs and their own personal experiences for that topic. But they cannot say, Ivy Tech feels this way, or Ivy Tech's position on this bill is this. That's left to me to do on behalf of the college. So just be aware that there is a political activity policy. However, we do like for our employees and staff and our students to be involved, and that allows individuals to hear directly about how the college is affecting students. So I do encourage you to write a letter to your congressperson or write a letter to your local legislator. You can set up an appointment to meet with them. I'm certainly happy to host people in a typical session. Now, again, right now, there are some things happening because of COVID. So it's more difficult for individuals to visit the State House, but I'm always happy to host individuals. And in prior years, we have set up days where students can come to the State House and attend committees, do a tour of the State House, speak with their local representatives. So those are some things that individuals can do to become involved, and just make your local legislator aware of what the college is doing. But again, just making sure that we're always within that political activity policy.
Absolutely. And just one thing that I do is if I do have contact with a legislator, I reach out to you and I just let you know, even if it's on a personal basis for some reason, unplanned. When I lived in Richmond, I used to run into them in the grocery store, just as you said. And so I would have told your counterpart at that time, hey, I had this conversation. They asked about this.
Yeah, that's also an important thing to note. Thank you for bringing that up, Kara. I mean, even the simplest question may have a bigger role to play when I hear it than what individuals who are not at the State House all the time get. So just dropping me a note and saying, hey, I had a conversation with this legislator and this is what we talked about, or this was the issue that they brought up. Sometimes I can connect dots just because I've heard conversations from others. So if you do talk to a legislator and they do talk about the college, shoot me a note, let me know. As I've indicated to chancellors over the course of the time that I've been here, I don't own these relationships, nor do I want to own these relationships. There are 150 state legislators. There are 9 congressional leaders. There are 2 senators. I can't possibly have close relationships with every single one, but just keep me informed and keep me in the loop. And that way I can help direct government relations activities and I can help advocate for the individual campuses as well as the college as a whole.
And don't forget that everybody needs to vote, because that is one of the most important ways that we all participate.
That absolutely. Always vote.
All right. Well, MJ, we wrap up every episode with a call to action. You've done a great job today in talking with us about what the role is that government relations plays in the college's life and how it impacts our relationships with government and community leaders. It's very important. I've seen it firsthand as you've worked with legislators. It's really important to have someone dedicated to this role. It quells concerns, they answer questions in a timely basis, and proactively make sure that a potential issue or a misunderstanding doesn't become a big problem. So I just appreciate the work that you do so much. And it gives us an opportunity to connect the agency employees at like the Commission for Education, Department of Workforce Development to us and to help make those relationships possible. So I just really appreciate what you do. And I think I've always appreciated one of the many ways I find meaning in my job at Ivy Tech is that we have an opportunity on a statewide level to impact policy. Other states watch other states. And so Ivy Tech's role in education nationally gets seen through some of the legislative actions that get taken in Indiana. And I appreciate the role that you play in that. So our call to action today, don't forget to vote. And if you are interested in knowing more about government relations, or you want to schedule a visit at the State House, make sure you contact MJ. We'll put her email address in the show notes. And MJ, anything else you want to add today?
No, Kara, just thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my role. I always say it's never the same day twice when you work in government relations. And that's one of the things that I appreciated about this role. But as you indicated, Ivy Tech is the biggest statewide undergraduate institute that the state has. And we have a unique role nationally because we are the biggest singly accredited institution. And so a lot of times the federal government will look to things that Ivy Tech is doing because we have that community college on a grand scale, is what I like to say. So associations nationally look to us and want us to speak for community colleges. And I just really appreciate having the opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. Well, you are welcome back anytime. And I think we're trying to arrange so you can come back right after session and talk about in maybe early May, sort of what happened during this session. So
hopefully we'll have good news.
Hopefully so. Thanks again to everybody for joining this episode of Our College of Voices. And I want to thank Mary Jane again for being our guest today. I'm your host, Kara Monroe. You can connect with me on Twitter at KNM Tweets. Our producer is Sarah Ferguson. You can reach us by email at ourcollegeyourvoices@ivytech.edu. Our website is ivytech.edu/podcast. It's maintained by the Ivy Tech Creative Services team, and production assistance for this and every episode is also provided by Becky Campbell. Theme music and post-production provided by Jen Eads at the Brossie Broadcasting Company, and we will talk to you next time on Our College, Your Voices.